Everyone in the north knows that a single look from my eyes will turn your beaten heart into a statue of cold, gray stone. But what the king doesn't know, as he drags me toward his bed, is that my gaze is the only thing keeping the sun from falling out of the sky. Chapter 1. Her world didn't just crumble. It turned to jagged glass, slicing her throat every time she tried to breathe. Juno stood in the knee-deep mud of the fringes, staring at the black, shriveled remains of the only beautiful thing she had seen in years. She had only wanted to touch the purple petal, just once, but her shadows had other plans. They were like starving dogs, always snapping, always hungry to devour the light. No matter how hard she tried, the monster inside her won. Truth be told, she wasn't an Omega because she was weak. She was an Omega because she was a walking graveyard. Next, the cold wind bit through her thin cloak, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the bitter tang of the village. Silas, the pack alpha, would be looking for her. He loved to see her cower. He loved the way she kept her head bowed, as if her neck was broken. Deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't hiding her face because of shame. She was hiding it because one look from her eyes could turn his wretched soul into stone. But Silas was a bully, and bullies don't see the storm inside the girl. They only see a target. Soon after, the first deep note of the king's horn rolled over the hills. It was a sound that made the very earth tremble, a roar of pure, raw power. Juno's heart skipped. This wasn't the local scouts. This was the king of the north, the Obsidian King. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer against her ribs. Before she could move, the shadows at her feet hissed. They stood up like blades of ink. They felt him coming, and they were excited. Have you ever felt the breath of a predator before you saw his teeth? At that moment, the silence of the forest became a roar. Juno turned and sprinted toward the village, her breath hitching. She couldn't be late for the tribute. If she was late, Silas would rip the veil from her face just to hear her scream. To make things worse, the air began to thicken with cedar and ozone. It was a heavy, masculine scent that made her skin hum. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she realized she wasn't just afraid of being caught. She was afraid of the pull in her blood. Moments later, she reached the square. The entire pack was lined up like cattle. Silas stood at the front, his chest puffed out like a king of nothing. Still, he caught her eye and sneered. He walked over, his heavy boots splashing mud onto her dress. "Late again, ghost?" he hissed. He had that smooth, fake kindness that made her want to vomit. "Maybe I should help you find your way by taking that rag off your head." What followed was a silence so heavy it felt like it would crush her lungs. Silas reached for her veil, his fingers twitching to humiliate her. Juno held her breath. "Don't do it, Silas," she prayed. "Don't make me kill you." Rather than fighting, she bowed lower. Her forehead almost touched the mud. In fact, she had spent 10 years being a victim just so she wouldn't have to be an executioner. This was her mask. This was her cage. This was her survival. But then, the gates groaned open. The sound of heavy paws hitting stone echoed like thunder. The Obsidian King didn't arrive with a parade. He arrived with a threat. He was massive, his black fur tipped with silver. As if fate demanded it, the temperature dropped. He shifted in a blur of fur and muscle, standing tall and scarred in the cold. He was a mountain of a man. He was a girl's nightmare. He was a kingdom's only hope. Without warning, Silas's arrogance evaporated. He dropped to one knee, and the pack followed. All except Juno. She stayed standing for a second too long. Her head was bowed, her veil fluttering in the wind. Time stood still. She felt his gaze, a heavy weight that traveled from her toes to her head. Beneath the moonlight, she was nothing but a shadow. Yet, he was looking at her as if she were the only person in the world. As if pulled by a string, the king walked past the beautiful, high-born females. He ignored the daughters of the elders who had painted their faces. Instead, his heavy boots stopped directly in front of Juno. With every step he took, the air grew hotter. The space between them burned. She could hear his heart, a slow, steady thrum. It was the sound of a predator who had found exactly what he was looking for. Why would a king choose a ghost over a rose? Between one breath, Orion reached out. He didn't grab her. He used one finger to lift her chin. Juno's breath caught. She kept her eyes squeezed shut. "Open them," he rumbled. His voice wasn't a request. It was an earthquake. As the silence roared, she realized she had a choice. She could look at him and end his life, or she could keep her eyes shut and let him take her into the dark. What's worse? Silas couldn't help himself. "Your Majesty, that one is a freak," he piped up. "She's a coward who won't even look at the sun." Still, Orion didn't move. His thumb traced her jaw, and the touch felt like a brand. It was the first time a wolf had touched her without flinching. She felt it, etched in fire. Her soul answered before her mind could. Despite that, she stayed silent. She didn't want to be his prize. But Orion leaned in close. His breath was warm against her veil. "I didn't come for a wife," he whispered, his voice for her alone. "I came for the thing that is killing the light in this valley. I found it." Because of that, Juno knew her secret wasn't safe. The king didn't want a queen. He wanted a monster to match his own. Come morning, the village was a memory. Juno was draped across the back of Orion's horse, her hands bound with soft leather. She wasn't fighting. As her wolf stirred, she felt a strange, terrifying peace. Orion rode behind her, his chest a solid wall against her back. Not only that, but he hadn't asked her to remove the veil again. He seemed content to just feel her there. Meanwhile, the journey to the citadel was a blur. Juno watched the ground through the bottom of her veil. Every time the horse stumbled, Orion's arm tightened around her waist. It wasn't the grip of a captor, it was the grip of an owner. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one who had to be afraid. Everyone else was. By the time they reached the black gates, Juno's thoughts spun. Why her? She was a low Omega. Yet, as the massive gates swung open, the guards didn't laugh. They bowed. They didn't see a coward. They saw a queen. She didn't know what scared her more, the enemies outside, or the way her heart throbbed when his scent filled her lungs. That night, Juno was taken to a room of glass and black stone. It was a beautiful cage. Still, she didn't take off her veil. What followed was a knock at the door. It was Orion. He walked in, his eyes glowing a fierce gold. He was a king of bones. He was a king of blood. He was a king of shadows. As the silence stretched, he sat across from her. He didn't try to touch her. "They told me you were a curse," he said, his voice low. "They told me you were the reason the crops died." Juno's chest ached. She wanted to tell him they were right. Instead, she whispered, "I am." But then Orion laughed. It was a dark sound. "Then we are a perfect match, Juno, because I am the reason this kingdom is built on bones." Even so, he didn't look away. "I won't force you to show me your eyes, but every day you spend here, I will give you a reason to want to." As her instincts surged, Juno felt a spark of rebellion. "And if I don't?" she asked. Orion stood up, his massive frame blotting out the moon. "Then you will remain my captive," he said. "But look around, little shadow. You're already a captive to your own fear. At least here, I'll be the one holding the key." Without another word, he left. Juno collapsed onto the bed. She felt the bond pulsing, thin as silk, but strong as iron. She was in the enemy's lair. To make things worse, she was falling for the man she was destined to destroy. In the stillness that followed, she realized the war hadn't ended. It had just moved inside her heart. The tension broke a few days later when the shadow plague hit. Juno was in the library when the lights began to flicker. Her shadows had begun to leak from her fingertips. They weren't just dark, they were hungry. They began to eat the light from the candles. Soon after, the door burst open. It was the high priest. "Abomination!" he screamed. "You are killing the light!" Before he could move, Juno's shadows lashed out like whips. They weren't under her control. They were protecting her. They wrapped around the priest's throat, and for a second, Juno felt a sick sense of power. Before the words left her lips, Orion appeared. He didn't shift. He simply walked into the room and stepped into the path of the shadows. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Juno tried to pull them back. "Orion, move!" she cried. But he didn't. He walked through the darkness, the shadows biting at his skin. He reached her and pinned her hands to her chest. As the echo faded, the shadows snapped back. Juno was sobbing. "I told you," she choked out. "I told you I'm a monster." Yet Orion didn't let go. He pulled her against his chest. "You're not a monster, Juno," he whispered. "You're just a queen who doesn't know how to rule her kingdom yet." At that moment, Juno realized the stakes had changed. Orion was willing to bleed just to keep her calm. Still, the priest wasn't done. "You are choosing a freak over your own people," he spat. "The pack will not follow a man who keeps a demon in his bed." What followed was a declaration of war. Orion's eyes turned into slits of gold. "Then let them run," he growled, "because if anyone touches her, I will turn this citadel into a graveyard myself." As the truth unraveled, Juno knew she couldn't stay a victim. She had to find a way to control the shadows before they destroyed the only man who had ever seen a woman instead of a weapon. Eventually, the silence was broken by a low, rumbling sound. It was Orion, humming a warrior's song. Her heart skipped. She wanted to take the veil off. She wanted to look at him and tell him she loved him. But she knew the price. If she looked at him, the song would end. The king would become a statue. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the tear from falling. It disappeared into her veil. Orion reached out and wiped it away. "Don't cry, little shadow," he murmured. "The dark is only scary if you're in it alone." As the bond pulsed, Juno felt the weight of his words. As the silence roared, she realized the true plot twist. the curse wasn't just in her eyes, it was in her heart. She was so afraid of hurting people that she had forgotten how to live. And Orion? He was waiting for her to stop being afraid. She didn't know what scared her more, the darkness or the light he brought out. But as the wind shifted, Juno made a silent vow. She would find a way to be his queen without being his destruction. As her bones remembered him, she leaned her head against his shoulder. Shadows danced between them, and she let it happen. She let herself hope. For the first time in her life, she was home. The air thickened as Juno stood by the narrow window of her glass room, watching the moon hang over the jagged peaks like a silver blade. She still wore the veil, even in the privacy of her room. Because the serpent shadows in her hair were restless, they could sense the thousands of wolves living beneath this roof. They were hungry for a feast. She was a girl of mud. She was a girl of shadows. She was a girl of secrets. And now she was a girl in a golden cage. Next, a heavy thud echoed against her door. It wasn't a request for entry. It was a command. Orion walked in, his massive frame filling the space until the air felt thin. He had discarded his royal furs. He wore only simple leather trousers that sat low on his hips. His skin glowed like burnished bronze in the firelight, and the scent of cedar and ozone followed him like a loyal hound. Soon after, he crossed the room with the silent grace of a predator. He stopped just inches away, the heat radiating from his body, making Juno's skin prickle. "You haven't eaten," he rumbled. His voice was a low vibration that settled deep in her chest. Truth be told, her stomach was in knots, but she couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't tell him that every time she looked at food, she saw it turning to gray ash in her mind. In fact, Orion didn't wait for her to answer. He reached out and took her hand. His calloused palm was rough, so rough, against her soft skin. The spark was immediate. It was a sizzle of electricity that made her breath catch. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she tried to pull away, but he held firm. He led her to a table laden with dark wine and meat. "In my house, we do not starve," he said, "and we do not hide from our king." What followed was a test of her resolve. Orion sat across from her, his golden eyes locked on the lace of her veil. He began to peel an orange, his movements slow and deliberate. "I know Silas was a dog," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "But here, you are protected. You don't need the rag, Juno." Still, she didn't move. She sat like a statue. Her heart was thundering so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Instead, she whispered, "The rag is for your protection, not mine." Orion paused. The orange was half peeled in his hand. He leaned forward. The tension between them snapped like a dry branch. The air thickened as he stared at her, as if trying to burn through the lace with his gaze alone. "I have survived wars. I have survived uprisings. I have survived the teeth of 100 alphas," he growled. "I think I can survive a look from the slip of a girl." But then, the shadows at Juno's neck gave a violent twitch. She felt them standing up, hissing at the challenge in his voice. Before she could move, the candles on the table flickered and died. The room was plunged into a thick, unnatural darkness. It wasn't the absence of light, it was the presence of something deeper. As the silence roared, Juno realized her control was slipping. Her shadows were leaking out. They were drawn to Orion's power like moths to a flame. What's worse, Orion didn't recoil. He didn't scream for the guards. Rather, he reached across the table in the pitch black and found her face. His hands were warm and steady. He was utterly unafraid. He framed her jaw, his thumbs brushing the edges of her veil. "Your shadows don't scare me, Juno," he whispered into the dark. "They feel like home." Moments later, the light returned as Juno forced the darkness back into her skin. She was trembling. Her lungs were burning for air. Orion was still holding her. His eyes were wider now, filled with a fierce, hungry curiosity. In that moment, she knew she was at a point of no return. He didn't want a trophy. He wanted the storm. And the more she tried to hide it, the more he wanted to be caught in the rain. By the time the sun began to peek over the mountains, the news of the Shadow King's prize had spread. The elder lichen court was already gathering in the great hall. They were old wolves. They were traditionalists. They believed a king's mate should be a purebred warrior, not a veiled freak from the fringes. As if fate demanded it, a messenger arrived at Juno's door. She was being summoned to the High Council. She had to prove she was worthy of the crown. No matter how hard she tried, Juno couldn't stop the cold dread from settling in her bones. She knew what they would ask. They would ask her to shift. They would ask her to show her wolf. And when she couldn't, when she showed them the serpents instead, they would kill her. She felt it, etched in fire. This was the catalyst. She either had to find a way to fake a shift, or she had to prepare for a massacre. Without another word, Orion appeared at her side. He looked at her bound hands and the veil she refused to shed. He didn't offer soft words. As if pulled by a string, he tucked her arm into his. "Head up, little shadow," he commanded. "Let them see the queen I chose, even if they have to guess at the face beneath the lace." As they walked toward the great hall, the castle held its breath. With every step he took, it was a promise of protection. But Juno knew the truth. Orion was a king. But even kings could be toppled by the fear of their people. As her wolf stirred, she realized she wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for his throne. As the wind shifted, the heavy oak doors of the council chamber swung open, and Juno let the shadows coil around her heart, ready for war. The air thickened as Juno stepped into the high council chamber, the sound of her own heart echoing against the vaulted stone like a funeral drum. Hundreds of high-ranking shifters sat in the shadows. Their eyes glowed like predatory embers in the dark. She was a girl in a den of monsters. She was a girl with a secret that could burn them all. What's worse, Orion's hand dropped from her arm as he took his place on the obsidian throne, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room. Next, the elder high priest stepped forward. His face was a map of deep scars and ancient hatred. He didn't look at Juno. He looked at the veil as if it were a stain on his floor. "The king has brought us a gift from the mud," he sneered. His voice was full of that smooth, sharp cruelty. "But a queen of the north must be a wolf. She must show us her spirit, or she must be cast out." Soon after, a low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, like dry leaves skittering over a grave. Juno felt the shadows at her neck begin to writhe, pulsing with a protective, violent energy. No matter how hard she tried, She couldn't keep her hands from shaking. She knew the test. They wanted her to shift. They wanted to see the fur, the claws, and the soul of a wolf. Deep down, she knew the truth. If she shifted now, they wouldn't see a wolf. They would see the end of their world. In fact, Orion didn't move to stop them. He sat perfectly still, his chin resting on his fist, watching her with a gold-eyed intensity that felt like a brand. Maybe it was fate, but she realized he wasn't being cruel. He was waiting to see if she would fight. In that moment, Juno realized that adaptation was her only choice. Because of that, she couldn't give them a wolf, so she had to give them a distraction. What followed was a moment of pure, calculated risk. Without thinking, Juno reached out with her mind to the shadows clinging to the corners of the room. She didn't raise her eyes, but she let her power bleed out through the soles of her feet. As if pulled by a string, the shadows began to climb the walls, snuffing out the torches one by one until the room was bathed in a ghostly silver light. But then the priest growled, a sound of pure animal rage. "Magic! She uses the dark arts to hide her weakness!" He lunged forward. His hands were already beginning to shift into massive, hairy claws. Before she could move, Juno felt a surge of adrenaline. Her body moved on instinct. She didn't shift into a wolf, but she moved like a serpent, sliding past his strike and spinning to face the throne. Still, the tension broke when Orion finally stood. The sheer weight of his presence made the priest freeze in midair. "She has shown you her power," Orion rumbled. His voice was like grinding stone. "She is a creature of the moon's shadow. If you cannot see the strength in that, perhaps you are the ones who are too weak to lead." As the silence roared, Juno felt a spark of victory. He had defended her, but she saw the look in the elder's eyes. They weren't finished. Moments later, Juno was led to the trial grounds. This was her first real test. This was her first chance to bleed. This was her first step toward the crown. As her wolf stirred, she felt a strange, primal hunger. She was tired of being the girl who hid. She wanted to be the girl who hit back. Rather, she was matched against a female warrior twice her size. The wolf woman laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Let's see what's under that lace, ghost," she spat. Without another word, the warrior lunged. Juno didn't look up. She listened. She heard the shift in the wind. She heard the scuff of a boot onto stone. Between one breath and the next, Juno dropped low and swept the warrior's legs, sending her crashing into the dirt. That's why the crowd went silent. They expected a victim. They found a fighter. Even so, Juno's victory felt hollow. She could feel the shadow plague growing inside her, a heavy, cold pressure that wanted to explode. She didn't know what scared her more, the warrior's claws, or the fact that she was starting to enjoy the feeling of her own power. That night, Juno returned to her glass room. Her muscles were aching and her soul was on fire. Orion was waiting for her on the balcony. He didn't say a word. He just handed her a bowl of cool water. As if fate demanded it, their fingers brushed. The space between them burned. "You did well today," he whispered. "But the elders are plotting. They know you aren't a wolf, Juno. They are looking for the monster." Because of that, Juno finally broke. She gripped the railing until her knuckles turned white. "I am a monster, Orion. Why won't you just let me go before I turn you to stone?" As the silence roared, Orion stepped into her space. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of shadow hair back under her veil. The moment their eyes locked, even through the lace, Juno felt her world tilt. Instead of pulling away, Orion leaned down until his forehead touched hers. "I told you, little shadow, I'm not afraid of the stone," he murmured. "I'm afraid of a world where I never got to meet the woman hiding behind it." As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Juno felt her heart ache. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to be vulnerable, but she knew that trust was a luxury a monster couldn't afford. Suddenly, a scream echoed from the lower levels. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of terror. As the wind shifted, Juno caught the scent of something rotting. The shadow plague hadn't stayed inside her. It had begun to leak into the castle's foundations, turning the stone to black, crumbling ash. What's worse, the elders were already pointing their fingers at her door. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and Juno realized the war had truly begun. The air thickened as Juno stared at the black, crumbling stone of her balcony. It wasn't just old rock, it was decaying, turning into a fine, soot-like powder that smelled of burnt ozone. Her shadows were no longer staying beneath her skin. They were leaking into the world. They were feeding on the very foundation of the citadel. What's worse, she could feel the sun's warmth fading from the sky, as if her presence was a hole in the universe that light couldn't fill. Next, a thunderous pounding shook the heavy oak doors of her suite. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic knock of Orion. It was the frantic, angry beat of the pack guards. Soon after, the door was kicked open. The elder high priest marched in, flanked by warriors in mid-shift, their muscles rippling, their fur bristling with murderous intent. "Look at what you have brought upon us!" the priest shrieked. He pointed at the rotting stone. "The shadows are eating the north!" In fact, Juno didn't even try to hide it. She stood in the center of the room, her veil fluttering in a cold wind that shouldn't have existed. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't pull the darkness back. It flowed from her fingertips like ink in water. "I didn't ask to be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. But then the priest lunged. He didn't wait for an explanation. He wanted blood. He wanted a sacrifice. Before she could move, a massive black blur intercepted the priest. Orion was there. His wolf form was partially bursting through his skin, claws extended, eyes a terrifying molten gold. He didn't growl. He roared. It was a sound that shook the glass windows until they cracked. When instead of backing down, the priest pointed at the window. "Look at the sky, King. Look at what your queen is doing to our world." What followed was the midpoint shift. Juno looked out the window and saw it. The sun was still in the sky, but it was turning a sickly, bruised violet. A ring of black shadow was slowly swallowing the light, creating a permanent, unnatural eclipse. Truth be told, she wasn't just a hybrid. She was the lunar eater. Her heart was a gravity well. The more she loved Orion, the more the world went dark. In that moment, the realization shattered her. Every spark of passion, every gentle touch from the king, was a death sentence for his people. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she realized the game had changed. The elders weren't just being mean. They were right. She was a plague. Still, Orion turned to her, his face a mask of fierce, stubborn protection. "I don't care about the sun," he rumbled. "I care about you." Because of that, the tension between them became a physical thing, a burning, heavy weight. As the silence roared, Juno saw the sacrifice he was making. He was willing to let his kingdom freeze in the dark just to hold her hand. She felt it, etched in fire. It was a love that was too big for the world. It was a love that was too dark for the day. It was a love that was too strong for the law. Moments later, the fallout hit. The pack outside was rioting. They could see the black sun. They could feel the unnatural cold. What's worse, the elders declared, a state of purity. They were stripping Orion of his command until the demon was removed. As the wind shifted, Juno caught the scent of treason. The warriors who had bowed to Orion yesterday were now sharpening their teeth for his throat. Rather than hiding, Orion took Juno to the highest tower. He wanted to show her he wasn't afraid. But as they stood together under the black sun, the space between them burned. The closer they got, the darker the sky became. It was a cruel, cosmic joke. As if pulled by a string, Juno stepped back. "Orion, every step you take toward me kills a part of your world," she choked out. But then Orion did something he had never done. He reached out and grabbed her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He didn't care about the shadows. He didn't care about the sky. The moment their eyes locked, even through the lace, the ground beneath them groaned. A crack appeared in the stone of the tower, snaking down toward the earth. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and Juno realized they were no longer just two people in love. They were a cataclysm. By the time the sun fully disappeared, leaving the citadel in a silver twilight, the elders made their move. They didn't attack Orion directly. They attacked the people's faith in him. What followed was a public decree. The king had 30 days to execute the Shadow Queen, or the pack would hunt them both. As her wolf stirred, Juno felt a cold, sharp resolve. She wouldn't let him die for her. Instead, she began to make a plan in the dark. She would find the source of the plague. She would go into the ancient roots beneath the castle, the place where the first wolves were born. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the voice in her head telling her she wouldn't come back. Deep down, she knew the truth. The only way to save the light was to become the darkness. As the echo faded, she stood on the balcony alone. Orion was downstairs, fighting a political war he couldn't win. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Juno looked at her hands. They weren't just stained with ink anymore. They were glowing with a pale, ghostly light. The transformation was accelerating. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She was becoming something the world hadn't seen in 1,000 years. Without another word, she stepped off the balcony, not falling, but gliding on a cloud of her own shadows. She was heading for the depths. She was heading for the truth. As her bones remembered him, she whispered his name into the cold air. She didn't know if he heard her, but she knew that by the time he saw her again, she would either be his savior or his most beautiful nightmare. The air thickened as Juno descended into the ancient roots beneath the citadel. The smell of damp earth and old magic hung heavy in the dark. This was the womb of the north, the place where the first wolves had crawled out of the shadows. What's worse, the deeper she went, the more her shadows seemed to merge with the walls. It was as if the castle itself was welcoming its monster home. She felt it, etched in fire. She wasn't just a guest in this darkness. She was its heart. Next, she reached the central cavern. It was a massive space where a single glowing vein of silver moonstone pulsed in the ceiling. Soon after, she heard a sound that made her blood turn to ice. It wasn't the wind. It was a growl, deep, primal, and filled with a pain that felt ancient. In fact, Juno didn't run. She stood her ground as a massive, twisted shape emerged from the gloom. It was a wolf, but it was made of the same black smoke that lived in her hair. No matter how hard she tried, Juno couldn't stop the shadows from lashing out to greet the creature. But then, the cave entrance exploded in a shower of stone and dust. Orion was there. He had followed her into the depths. His body was battered from the riots above. His eyes were burning with a desperate, hungry light. "I told you to stay in the light!" he roared. His voice echoed off the cavern walls like a physical blow. Before she could move, Orion lunged. He didn't lunge at her, but at the shadow wolf. Instead of shifting fully, he fought in a half state. His claws tore through the smoke as if it were solid flesh. What followed was a dance of teeth and shadows. Juno watched in horror as the man she loved bled for her once again. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She realized she couldn't keep her power locked away if she wanted him to live. Because of that, Juno finally made her choice. She reached up and ripped the lace veil from her face. She tossed it into the dark like a piece of trash. As the silence roared, she opened her eyes. They weren't brown or blue. They were swirling whirlpools of violet and void. The moment their eyes locked, Orion froze. He didn't turn to stone. Rather, he gasped as the bond between them flared into a white-hot flame. In that moment, the shadow wolf dissolved into mist. It could not stand the heat of their connection. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Juno felt the impossible happen. Her shadows didn't just leak out, they transformed. They became wings of dark light, lifting her off the ground. Still, the cavern began to groan. The black sun above was pulling on the moonstone. It was trying to drain the very life from the earth. Moments later, Orion scrambled to his feet. He stared up at her in awe. He didn't see a monster. He didn't see a plague. Truth be told, he saw his mate in her full, terrifying glory. "Juno," he whispered. Her name hung in the air like a prayer. What's worse, the elders chose that moment to arrive. They had followed the king. Now they stood at the edge of the cavern, their faces pale with terror. Rather than hiding, Juno turned her gaze on them. She didn't turn them to stone. She showed them the truth. She showed them the black sun. She showed them the rotting world. As the wind shifted, she realized that the only way to stop the plague was to offer herself as a conduit. She had to take all the darkness into her own soul. She had to walk into the lunar gate at the back of the cave. As if pulled by a string, she drifted toward the shimmering portal of void. But then Orion caught her hand. His grip was a brand. It was a promise. It was a chain. "If you go, I go," he growled. The space between them burned. Juno looked at him, her violet eyes filling with tears. "You have a kingdom to lead, Orion." Instead of letting go, He pulled her closer until their chests were touching. What followed was a kiss that felt like the end of the world. It was a kiss of salt and cedar. It was a kiss of ash and ozone. As her wolf stirred, Juno felt the bond pulse with a power that could move mountains. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't pull away. She was committing to a path that had no return. She was choosing to be the queen of the shadows, so he could be the king of the light. Deep down, she knew the truth. The elders would never accept this. Even as they watched in silence, she saw the daggers in their hands. To make things worse, the moonstone above cracked. It sent a shower of silver sparks onto the floor. The time was up. The black sun was reaching its peak. Without another word, Juno stepped into the portal, dragging Orion with her into the unknown. As the echo faded, the cavern fell silent. The elders stood alone in the dark, staring at the empty space where their king had been. As her bones remembered him, Juno felt the cold of the void swallowing her whole. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know if they would survive. While the forest held its breath, she only knew one thing. She wasn't alone in the dark anymore. The air thickened as Juno tumbled out of the portal and slammed into a cold stone floor. It wasn't the citadel. It wasn't the roots. It was a place of endless mirrors and gray mist. The in-between. What's worse, when she reached out for the warmth of Orion's hand, she found only empty air. He was gone. The portal had split them apart, leaving her alone in a world that reflected every one of her failures back at her. Next, she scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted like copper. Soon after, the mirrors around her began to glow with a sickly violet light. She saw herself, not as a queen, but as the ghost Omega covered in mud. She saw the purple flower she had killed. She saw the black sun swallowing the sky. In fact, the shadows in her hair were no longer wings. They were chains, dragging her down into the mist. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find Orion's scent. But then, a mirror in front of her shattered. In the shards, she saw him. Orion was back in the citadel, but he wasn't the king anymore. He was trapped in a cage of black stone, his body turning to gray, lifeless rock from the feet up. The shadow plague was finishing what it started. Because she had pulled him into her world, she had accelerated his end. Before she could move, a voice drifted through the mist. It was her own voice, but it was cold and hollow. "You thought love would save him?" The reflection mocked. "You are a lunar eater, Juno. You don't save things, you consume them." Instead of fighting back, Juno sank to her knees. Her heart felt like a lead weight. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She realized that by trying to keep him, she was killing him. Because of that, the all-is-lost moment settled over her like a shroud. She looked at her hands, which were now pulsing with a dark, rhythmic hunger. As the silence roared, she felt the bond with Orion fraying. It was a thin, glowing thread that was turning black. She felt it, etched in fire. If she didn't let go of the bond, if she didn't sever her heart from his, he would become a statue forever. At that moment, Juno faced her greatest fear. She had to choose between a life of loneliness and the death of her mate. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she realized the elders had been right about one thing. She was a weapon. Still, She didn't want to be the weapon that broke the king. She reached for the thread of their bond, her fingers trembling as she prepared to snap the only thing that made her feel human. Moments later, the mist around her began to thicken into solid walls. The mirrors vanished, leaving her in a dark, silent void. What's worse, she felt the final spark of Orion's heat fade away. She let out a scream that had no sound, her soul breaking in two. As the wind shifted, she lay on the floor, a broken girl in a world of nothing. The Shadow Queen was gone. There was only the girl who had loved too much and lost everything. Rather than finding hope, she found a quiet, cold resignation. She had failed. The sun was gone. Orion was stone, and she was the reason why. As if pulled by a string, she closed her eyes, wishing for the void to take her too. Between one breath and the next, the darkness began to swallow her toes, her knees, her heart. She didn't fight it. She welcomed the end. That's why the betrayal of her own heart hurt the most. She had trusted fate, and fate had laughed at her. Even so, as the darkness reached her throat, she heard a faint, distant sound. It wasn't a growl. It was a song. The same warrior's lullaby Orion had hummed to her in the tower. She didn't know what scared her more, the idea that he was still fighting, or the idea that she had to find the strength to fight for him one last time. But then, the darkness didn't kill her. It waited. As the silence roared, Juno realized she was in the crucible. This was the lowest point. This was the dark night of her soul. As her wolf stirred, a tiny flicking flame of violet light appeared in the center of her chest. It was the part of her that belonged to him. It was the part of her that refused to turn to stone. What followed was a moment of quiet reflection. "What would you have done in my place?" she whispered to the shadows. She looked at the fraying black bond and didn't snap it. Instead, she wrapped it around her wrist. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't give up. Not yet. Deep down, she knew the truth. The darkness wasn't her enemy. It was her armor. As the echo faded, Juno stood up in the void. She was weak. She was alone. She was terrified. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she looked into the darkness and didn't blink. She was going to find a way back. She was going to break the stone. Without another word, she began to walk into the gray mist, following the faint, fading song of a king who refused to die. The air thickened as Juno marched through the gray mist, her bare feet silent on the cold floor of the in-between. Every step she took was a battle against the crushing weight of her own guilt. What's worse, the mirrors began to appear again, but this time they didn't show her failures. They showed the truth of her bloodline, the ancient lunar eaters who hadn't been monsters, but guardians who swallowed the darkness so the sun could shine. In fact, she wasn't a plague. She was a filter. Next, she reached the heart of the mist where a giant, frozen star hung in the air. It was the source of the shadow plague, a corrupted piece of the moon that had been feeding on her fear. Soon after, she heard Orion's song again, louder now, vibrating through the soles of her feet. No matter how hard she tried to stay small, the violet flame in her chest roared to life. She realized that the only way to save him wasn't to cut the bond, but to pull every drop of the corruption out of him and into herself. At that moment, Juno reached out and grabbed the frozen star with her bare hands. But then, a searing, white-hot pain tore through her arms, turning her veins into rivers of liquid fire. As the silence roared, she didn't let go. She pulled. She drank the darkness like it was water. What followed was a transformation that made her bones scream. Her serpentine shadows didn't just grow. They fused with her skin, becoming a suit of obsidian armor that glowed with a celestial violet light. Because of that, the gray mist of the in-between began to shatter like glass. Juno felt the bond with Orion snap taut, pulling her back toward the living world with the force of a falling star. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she saw the citadel again. It was covered in snow and ice, the black sun hanging like a dead eye in the sky. Still, she saw him. Orion was on the executioner's block, his body almost entirely stone, while the high priest raised a silver axe to shatter him. Moments later, Juno exploded out of the shadows of the great hall. She didn't arrive as a girl. She arrived as a goddess of the void. The moment their eyes locked, even though Orion's were turning to gray flint, a spark of recognition flared in the depths of his soul. As if pulled by a string, Juno lunged across the room, her obsidian wings knocking the guards aside like they were made of straw. Without warning, the priest swung the axe. Instead of hitting stone, the silver blade struck Juno's armored forearm and shattered into 1,000 pieces. What followed was a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Juno looked the priest in the eye, unveiled, unafraid, and radiant. "You wanted to see the monster," she whispered, her voice echoing with the power of the moon. "Now look at your queen." Rather than running, the priest tried to shift, but the darkness in the room obeyed Juno now. It wrapped around his limbs, pinning him to the floor. As the sky darkened further, Juno turned to the stone statue of her mate. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. Between one breath and the next, she pressed her lips to his cold, stone mouth and exhaled all the light she had stolen from the frozen star. That's why the miracle happened. The gray stone began to crack and peel away, revealing warm, bronze skin beneath. As the bond pulsed, Juno felt Orion's heart give a heavy, singular thud. Her world tilted as his hand, no longer stone, reached up to cup the back of her neck. He pulled her down into a kiss that tasted like life and victory. Even so, the battle wasn't over. The elders were howling for blood, and the black sun was still draining the world. In that heartbeat, the world shifted, and Juno knew what she had to do for the final push. She had to take the crown by force. As her wolf stirred, she turned to the assembled pack, her violet eyes burning through the twilight. "The king lives!" she roared. "And the sun will return, but only if you choose to follow the light I carry." Before either could speak, the pack began to howl, not in fear, but in a primal, desperate hope. To make things worse, the high priest used his last bit of strength to trigger a collapse of the great hall's pillars. As the silence roared, the ceiling began to cave in. Without thinking, Orion shifted into his massive black wolf form, shielding Juno with his own body as the stones fell. In the span of a breath, they were buried in a mountain of rubble. Deep down, she knew the truth. This was the final test of their physical survival. Eventually, a single beam of violet light pierced through the debris. Juno pushed the stones off them with a wave of her hand, standing tall amidst the ruins. As her bones remembered him, she saw Orion emerge from the dust, his fur matted but his eyes clear and gold. What followed was the final realization. They didn't need the old laws. They were the new law. As the echo faded, Juno looked up at the black sun. She raised her hands, and the shadows she had taken into her soul began to flow back out. Not as a plague, but as a bridge of light. With his scent in the air, she felt Orion stand beside her. They were ready. The final confrontation with the source of the curse was seconds away. And she let it happen, because she was no longer afraid of what she was. She was the Shadow Queen, and the morning was finally coming. The air thickened as Juno stood amidst the ruins of the great hall, her hands raised toward the bruised, violet sky. The black sun was a hungry eye, but she was the lid that would finally close it. What's worse, the high priest scrambled from the rubble, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate madness. He didn't see the beauty in the violet light. He only saw the end of his ancient cruel ways. In fact, he lunged one last time, a jagged stone shard in his hand, screaming a curse that died in his throat. Before the words left her lips, Orion, in his massive obsidian wolf form, snapped his jaws shut inches from the priest's chest. He didn't kill him. He pinned him to the earth with a single, heavy paw, forcing the traitor to watch as the world changed. Next, Juno closed her eyes and reached for the very center of her soul. She felt the darkness she had gathered, and she began to spin it. Soon after, the violet light intensified, turning into a pillar of celestial fire that shot straight into the heart of the black sun. The moment their eyes locked, Juno's violet gaze meeting Orion's golden stare, the bond flared with a heat that could melt mountains. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she didn't just push the shadows away. She pulled the sun back through the void. What followed was a sound like 1,000 glass bells shattering at once. The black sun cracked. The violet sky broke. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and the first true ray of golden morning light hit the peaks. As the silence roared, the shadow plague dissolved into nothing but mountain mist. The rotting stone of the citadel began to glow with a new, healthy warmth. Because of that, the pack fell into a deafening silence. They watched as the darkness was swallowed by the woman they had called a monster. At that moment, the mockery ended forever. Moments later, Orion shifted back into his human form, standing tall amidst the dust of his old throne room. As if pulled by a string, Juno descended from the air, her obsidian armor fading back into her simple dress. Yet, she didn't reach for her veil. She let the morning light hit her face, her violet eyes shining like jewels. Between one breath and the next, Orion reached her. He gathered her into his arms, his forehead resting against hers. "My queen," he whispered. Truth be told, she had spent her life waiting for the end, but standing in his arms, she realized this was only the beginning. Falling Action, Part 1, began as the remaining pack members stepped forward and dropped to their knees. They weren't bowing to a king's decree anymore. They were bowing to the woman who had saved their souls. As the wind shifted, the scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air. Juno looked at the people and saw not fear, but a found family that was finally ready to grow. Eventually, the day came for their official coronation. Juno stood on the new balcony, the one that no longer crumbled under her touch. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, She looked out at the thousands of wolves howling her name. She was the girl of light. She was the woman of shadows. She was the queen of the north. As her bones remembered him, she felt Orion's hand slide into hers. "Are you ready, my shadow queen?" he asked. Without another word, Juno stepped to the edge of the railing and raised her hand. She didn't use her shadows to dim the sun. She used them to create a beautiful, shimmering aurora that danced across the daylight sky. As the silence roared, she realized the transformation was complete. She was no longer the girl who wouldn't look the king in the eye. She was the woman who had stared into the void and made it blink. Deep down, she knew the truth. The world would always have shadows, but she was no longer afraid of the dark. And she let it happen. See, leaning into Orion as the pack's howl reached a fever pitch. Their fairy tale was no longer a dream. It was a reality built on stone, soul, and a vow that would never be broken. The morning light revealed the impossible, and the impossible was simply this: that a monster and a king could create a love that saved the world. 2 years later, the snow still falls in the north, but the gardens of the citadel stay green. A small child with golden eyes and violet-tinted hair runs through the grass. As if fate demanded it, Juno and Orion watch from the balcony. Looking back, I should have known. Juno whispers that the darkness was only ever waiting for you to find me. The sun sets, but the light never fades.